What if the blind spot in social neuroscience is that we've been studying social life, but without the social part? Like we've been scanning people's brains while they stare at faces on a screen, and then we call it interaction. Today, we're talking with someone who's helped push the field forward towards studying the brain during real social interactions and doing it across development. We're talking with Dr. Liz Redcay.
Cracking that shell now. Abby, Ben, Mike, Joey, let's go.
Cracking the shell on the mic, psychological science in sight. Abby bringing that fire sparks when she speaks, ignition on sight. Been with the breakdown, mind state, takedown, never miss the details. Mike hitting concepts heavy like freight trains on steel rails. Joey steady mapping brainwaves, decoding how we feel. They turn that abstract real. Yeah, the knowledge is real.
They peel it back slow, layer after layer. Mind so deep, yeah, we ride that elevator. Cracking the shell.
Yeah, we dive into.
Welcome back to Cracking the Shell on Psychological Science. I'm Mike.
And I'm Joey, and today we're joined by Dr. Elizabeth Redcay, whose work examines the development and neural mechanisms of social interaction and social cognition in both typical development and autism.
Howdy, Liz. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk.
Okay, great. So to set the stage, when people hear social cognition, they often think theory of mind or emotion recognition or empathy. But your work emphasizes that these processes unfold in live, dynamic contexts. So what's the core question that drives your lab?
So I'd say the core question is thinking about how we navigate social interactions, how we form social connections, what makes those social connections successful, and also what brain systems support that. So thinking about that, especially across development and thinking about it in autism, where those interactions can be particularly challenging.
So, Liz, I've known you for now, I want to say about 15 years, roughly, and I still don't know exactly how you got into this line of research. What is it about social cognition and autism that drew you in to make this part of your life's work?
Yeah, so, initially I really became fascinated with thinking about just links between the brain and behavior. So how, variability within individuals' brains can lead to such differences in behavior, and particularly thinking about how changes in the brain can change development over time. And that was from, a combination of personal experiences and coursework. So when I was seeking out graduate, for my PhD, I was trying to find a lab, and I was looking into different labs that were really studying the neuroscience of different developmental conditions. And so that's what kind of brought me to this lab at UC San Diego that was focused on the neuroscience of autism. And that was kind of my first introduction to autism, and where I really got to know what autism was and get to know different working with autistic youth, autistic adults, and see first just how variable autism was, thinking there's so much heterogeneity, which was fascinating itself, that so many such a different range of behavioral features could kind of lead to the same diagnosis. And then also thinking about the sort of core challenges with navigating one's social world. And, if you think about it, like social interactions from the very first moment of life are just pervasive and shape so much of what we do. They're so important for our language development, cognitive development, for our well-being. So it just was really important to understand what is underlying some of these challenges. How can we better understand them? And then how can we provide the right supports to help individuals who are dealing with social challenges?
That's a nice segue into talking about sort of the nuts and bolts of your research. So let's talk about what makes your research unique in the field of social neuroscience. A lot of classic neuroscience experiments are what people call third-person experiments. You watch a person or see a photo or hear a story. Your work pushes towards second-person approaches, studying social cognition as it actually unfolds between people. Why does this matter?
It matters because interaction isn't just perception. So in real life, there's this contingency. I do something, you respond, I adjust, and that loop changes the attention, motivation, and kinds of inferences that we make about one another.
Okay, so it's not simply more realistic. It can recruit different computations?
Yeah, exactly. So when we believe we're interacting with a person, it can change the neural systems that are engaged. So these include systems like thinking about what other people are thinking, so thinking about other people's minds, and networks that support engagement and attention.
So for listeners, it's like the difference between watching a tennis match and playing tennis. Same objects, totally different demands. It's one thing to observe someone responding to their opponent's volley. It's much different to be reacting to a volley in real time and anticipating the next shot.
And this matters for autism research too, because some social challenges show up most strongly in live social contexts, right?
Right, yeah, that's the key point. So many autistic people can do well on structured lab tasks, but yet still find real-world interactions difficult. So if we were only studying those static or more structured tasks, we might miss what's actually driving these everyday challenges.
So another thread in your work is using more naturalistic stimuli, like maybe movies or extended narratives, to capture how social understanding unfolds over time. Why are these approaches so powerful?
So social life has structure over seconds to minutes, tracking goals, updating impressions, integrating context, and naturalistic paradigms let us measure brain responses to complex, temporally extended social information. And we can use tools that quantify how similarly different people's brains respond to the same social events.
So that's such a key idea. It's not just about which region lights up, but the timing and coordination of networks as the story unfolds.
And developmentally, it seems especially relevant, right? Kids' social worlds, they change very quickly, right? They have friendships, school dynamics, and perspective taking and all that.
Yes, right. And we can also ask how neural systems for social understanding mature. How do children become better at integrating information across time? And how does that relate to their everyday social functioning?
So, Liz, earlier you brought up the term heterogeneity. Recently, there's been a wave of work suggesting that there may be distinct clusters, for example, in autism traits. Can you walk us through what this research actually means and what's new here?
Yeah, absolutely. So the big shift is that researchers are moving from thinking about autism as a single continuum, like more or less autistic traits, for example, toward asking whether there are qualitatively different profiles. And they're doing this at scale, so using very large samples. So there's one recent paper in Nature Genetics, and it took this very large data set of autistic children and adults and used person-centered statistical modeling. So that's basically where you let the data tell you how to separate people out into groups that have different patterns of traits or co-occurring features. And they found a solution with 4 latent classes. And what's important is that these classes or profiles or groups weren't just mild to severe. They differed in their configuration of characteristics. So things like their social communication features, repetitive behaviors, and developmental or language differences, as well as co-occurring conditions like mental health or ADHD.
Right. So the idea is different packages of traits tend to travel together?
Yeah, exactly. And then the study went a step further. That's really important. So it asked whether those different phenotypic packages map onto different genetic signals. So they reported the class showed different patterns of genetic enrichment. And they link them to different developmental gene programs. So this suggests that there may be multiple biological routes that can lead to an autism diagnosis.
So that's the phenotype plus genetics side. What about the neuroscience angle?
Yeah, so another major piece comes from a Nature Neuroscience study that tackled heterogeneity from the brain side. Instead of starting with behavioral classes, they started with functional brain network connectivity. And they asked, can we describe individual differences in autism in terms of underlying dimensions that connect brain and behavior? So they identified 3 latent dimensions or patterns that relate to different aspects of cognition and symptoms. Things like variation in verbal cognitive abilities, social affective traits, and restricted or repetitive behaviors. So then when participants were clustered based on where they fell along those dimensions, then the analysis yielded 4 reproducible subgroups. And those subgroups then have distinct connectivity signatures. So like different network level fingerprints and different behavioral profiles.
And they also try to connect that back to biology beyond connectivity, right?
Right. So they integrate the brain network patterns with maps of gene expression. And so that's to infer potential molecular pathway associations. In other words, they suggest that different connectivity altered subgroups may relate to different underlying biological, specifically genetic mechanisms. So that's still an inferential step, but it's part of a broader push to connect the levels: behavior, brain, networks, molecular biology.
Now, is there a developmental angle to this work?
Glad you asked. So there's a third recent paper using a similar kind of profile approach. It showed that the age of diagnosis, so early versus late diagnosis, seems to actually differentiate 2 groups of autistic individuals that vary in a range of behavioral features and co-occurring conditions. And what's striking is that they seem to have pretty different genetic profiles. So, I should note that there are structural barriers that may affect the age of diagnosis, but this paper is suggesting, like, if you removed all of those structural barriers, there still is this kind of genetic difference, and the behavioral features kind of emerge early versus late in getting a diagnosis.
Can you say something about these structural barriers, just so our listeners understand what you're talking about?
Yeah, so structural barriers would include things like not having access to diagnosis. So that there are often very long wait lists to get a diagnosis. They, if you don't have insurance, then they can be very expensive, so they wouldn't be covered by those costs. There also can be structural racism that's playing in. So we know that boys of color in particular might be misdiagnosed. If the autistic boys who might get misdiagnosed with, for example, behavioral problems or like oppositional defiant disorder where it's really autism. So it can take a long time to kind of get to an accurate diagnosis.
Okay, so returning to these papers. So if you put these papers side by side, what's the responsible bottom line for our listeners?
So the responsible bottom line is we're accumulating evidence that autism heterogeneity can be decomposed in these structured ways. So for example, from a couple of the papers into 4 groups, depending on the method and the data set. But we shouldn't treat these clusters as fixed natural kinds. They're best thought of as useful models that can help design better studies and eventually, importantly, think about how to design better supports. So different profiles likely do have different support needs. And importantly, these models highlight also that averaging across all autistic people will wash out these meaningful signals. So if different subgroups have different brain network mechanisms or genetic programs, then a single autism versus control result can be an oversimplification.
So how does this connect back to your lab's focus on real interactions?
So suggest a practical next step. So we should be asking whether these different profiles show different patterns during live social interaction. So for example, differences in social learning, reciprocity, maybe anxiety in this kind of real-time exchange, or synchrony or alignment between individuals. And if we can identify which social contexts are challenging for which profiles and in which ways, that moves us closer to thinking about mechanisms that matter in daily life and to these supports that are better tailored to individual rather than the average autistic person.
So there's growing interest in studying synchrony, how behavior and physiology align between people, and even how neural signals relate across 2 individuals. When people hear brain syncing, they can get a little sci-fi about it. What's a grounded way to think about it?
Yeah, so a grounded view is that during interaction, people coordinate behaviors, attention, emotions, and these measures of synchrony can index aspects of that coordination. But we have to be careful about what it means and what drives it. So is it that it's a shared stimulus, or is it true interaction dynamics?
Okay, so synchrony isn't automatically good or bad, and it doesn't automatically mean minds are merging, right?
Exactly. So in the lab, we've shown that being in sync behaviorally can actually lead to both positive or negative social outcomes, depending on the behavior. So while the method's promising, the theory and design really matter.
All right, lightning round time. Short answers, whatever comes to mind.
Okay, one misconception about neuroscience, social neuroscience, you wish would go away.
That you can fully understand social cognition using only static, non-interactive tasks.
Okay. How about a method or tool that you think will shape the next 5 years?
I think we really need still better computational and analytic methods for naturalistic and interaction data. There's such rich data sets, but we need to be able to parse that complexity. And I think AI will probably play a large role in advancing that.
Okay, how about a question you're most excited about?
So at the end of the day, the most important thing is that this work we're doing with autistic individuals is actually addressing the questions that they care about. And so my lab currently is really focused a lot on understanding social connection and loneliness, taking some of these ideas of, understanding real world social interaction. We want to know what predicts it, how do autistic youth experience loneliness, and what can we do to reduce it. And I'm also very interested in kind of other directions of thinking about chatbots and AI, how those can actually be helpful social tools, but also how they could be harmful. So really better disentangling and understanding how those are affecting youth, including and especially for autistic youth. Before
we close this down, do you have any final thoughts?
Yes. So there's a really important part of the story that we haven't actually touched on yet. And that is that whether a social interaction is successful, so by successful, I mean, for example, a social connection is formed, or 2 people are able to communicate their ideas and reach a common understanding. So whether that happens really depends on both people within the social interaction. And really for too long, the focus was only on how the autistic person was not understanding the neurotypical person. But there's a newer theory that's gaining a lot of attention and very influential called the double empathy problem. And that highlights that these misunderstandings really go both ways. And the burden should shift at least equally, if not more so, to the neurotypical person to really try to understand the autistic person to improve communication. And our work on social interaction supports this idea. So we see that higher synchrony, and in some cases stronger rapport, is there when autistic people are interacting with other autistic people, but not with neurotypical people. So what's really cool about this is that we see some direct translational impacts. So with other UMD colleagues here, we've developed training programs for neurotypical people. And this is to help improve understanding of autistic people. So in doing this, we can try to close the gap to improve this autistic neurotypical mutual understanding.
Well, Liz, it's been wonderful having you on the show today. I hope we can have you back at some point.
Thanks. This was great.
If listeners want to learn more about Dr. Redcay's lab and research, we'll link the Developmental Social Cognitive Neuroscience lab site in the show notes.
In the meantime, I'm Mike.
And I'm Joey.
Abby got the wisdom, dropping pearls on the mic. Ben with the insights, sharp as a spike. Mike's got the vibe, always keeping it chill. Joey cracks jokes, flexing comedy skills. Four minds collide, the convo's electric. Cracking the shell, peeling layers, eclectic. Topics on deck, from the D to the fun. Every episode's a journey, we've only begun. Cracking the shell, yeah, we're cracking it well. Stories and laughs, got a world to unveil. Abby, Ben, Mike, Joey, ring the bell. Turn it up loud, it's the podcast that tells. Cracking the shell, yeah, we're cracking it well. Stories and laughs, got a world to unveil. Abby, Ben, Mike, Joey, ring the bell. Turn it up loud, it's the podcast that tells. Deep dives, big laughs, always something to say. Pop culture to philosophy, they pave the way. From the wild to the wise, it's a balancing act. Brains meet banter, that's a podcast fact. Abby's dropping gems like a treasure chest. Ben dissects ideas, puts them to the test. Mike smooth to lick me's, cool as the breeze. Joey's punchlines hit, bring you to your knees. Crack the code, crack the case. Crack a smile, let it light up your face. Four voices, one rhythm, keep the pace.
Hey, this is Mike from Cracking the Shell on Psychological Science. Just a quick thank you to all of our listeners. Joey, Abby, Ben, and I really love putting these episodes together for you. If you enjoy them as much as we do, we'd really appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button and share it with your friends and family. It's free and it helps us more than you might think. While I'm at it, I'd like to give a big shout out to Anthropic's Claude and Suno AI for their help behind the scenes today. If you have ideas for a future episode or just want to say hi, email us at crackingtheshellonpsychology@gmail.com. Until next time, remember that the most beautiful minds are often the ones that see things differently.